Thank you very much, Jonathan. Unable to travel during the pandemic, I spent my time really exploring past pandemics, not the medical aspects or the epidemiological aspects, which I have no expertise in, but really to look at the economic consequences, the social consequences, psychological effects, the political effects of these, the consequences for armed conflict, for terrorism, for bioterrorism. And like any explorer, I kept a journal which ultimately turned into a brief book which comes out next week. This is the kind of book you buy in an airport. It's a small, slender, fast read. As my editor, as he tore out entire paragraphs and pages, told me, "You're not writing a government report, Brian. You are not writing an academic brick. This is something people are supposed to read." At any rate, in trying to look at these past pandemics for clues about the post-pandemic landscape, it was a fascinating journey. By the way, what makes the slides change here? If we look at the pandemic, there was really nothing comparable in the last, it's that one, okay. Nothing comparable in the last 100 years. Let's go back for a moment. We have an unknown virus emerging in Wuhan, China. It spreads quickly throughout the world. Financial markets start to crash. Unemployment rates soar. In less than 3 years, COVID-19 has killed 6.5 million people. That's not anywhere near the Black Death of the 14th century, which killed half the population of Europe. But actually, it's not an insignificant event, and in fact, those numbers that are recorded are an under-counting of it, according to recent research that was done, came out just this last summer. The actual toll is likely to be 3 times that many, so we're looking at 18 to 20 million people. That will put it into one of the category of the top 10 human disasters since the beginning of the 20th century. But it's not just lives lost or devastated economies. Plagues have legacies of social disorder, political repercussions. In many respects, the COVID-19 pandemic paralleled past pandemics. Historians who have written about these would actually not be surprised by a lot of the things that we saw during the pandemic. The pandemics, COVID-19, like previous pandemics, exposed and exacerbated existing inequities in society. Rich got richer, escaped to their ranches in Montana or their getaways in New Zealand. Those lower on the economic ladder drove the delivery trucks that enabled everyone else to work from home. And the exposure to disease and the death tolls were significantly uneven. There was resistance to the health control measures. That's a common feature of pandemics, which require government intervention in places where governments don't normally intervene. Blaming others, scapegoating, is a common feature in pandemics, past and present. The Jews are always blamed throughout history for pandemics. Gypsies, Asians, we saw an increase in violence against Asians as a result of the pandemic, foreigners, immigrants. Conspiracy theories, bizarre beliefs were not unique to COVID-19. They regularly occur. The difference was the internet, which allowed these to spread wider and faster. We saw increases in lawlessness, increases in violence. The murder rate in the United States went up 25% in a single year. On the other hand, the COVID-19 also differed from previous pandemics. Fewer have died in the COVID-19 pandemic, even if we accept that higher figure of 18 to 20 million. That's roughly 1% of the world's population. Measures to slow the contagion seemed more pervasive because of the more efficient efforts in some cases and the way these were rolled out and covered, including in the media. Modern medicine, antiviral drugs, life support systems in intensive care units, and ultimately, of course, a vaccine saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Vaccine was a new feature of this pandemic, but we also have more anti-vaxxers. The COVID-19 pandemic had a devastating economic impact for many, not all. As I say, the effects were unequal within nations. They were unequal between nations. Less developed countries have been hit the hardest. They will take longer to recover as a consequence of COVID-19. We are looking at somewhere between half a billion, some people say as many as a billion people pushed back into extreme poverty. That reverses a long-term trend. The situation, of course, has been complicated by the war in Ukraine and the consequences of that, leading to food shortages, energy shortages, inflation, and of course we're looking down the road to the impact of climate change. All of that is going to drive refugees. It's going to drive immigration, legal and illegal. And that's going to drive people toward destinations that are already hostile to immigration and thereby increasing social tensions. The post-pandemic moodscape, we're already seeing an angrier, more pessimistic tenor of society. As in previous pandemics, COVID-19 saw what was growing malaise in society. Many previous pandemics also saw declines in rational thought. They left a lasting legacy of distrust. And in fact, in some cases, this distrust in institutions, distrust in each other, persisted not only for the generation that was exposed to the pandemic, but in fact was inherited by their children and even their grandchildren. People are on edge, quick to violence. What we're seeing is not entirely a new phenomenon because it preceded the COVID-19 pandemic, but certainly has been exacerbated by it. And that is an increase in random, unprovoked violence in public places. This is people being pushed off of subway or metro platforms into oncoming trains, people just being attacked at random. These are not ordinary crimes connected with robbery or anything like that. They don't have a political nexus. It's not terrorism. These are just indicating a certain amount of stress in society and people attacking one another. All of this has political consequences. I think the biggest political casualty is governability itself. Democracies didn't perform strikingly well in this. In fact, if you look at the list of democratic nations of the world, according to indices of this, more than 2/3 of them had mortality rates significantly higher than the global average. Now, there's a lot of undercounting in that, but that doesn't explain it entirely. The fact is that we didn't do as well. Progress toward democracy declined, wiping out 15 years of steady gain. A number of publications in the past year have talked about democracy being in free fall in the world. That's probably an overstatement, but certainly the pandemic contributed to that kind of pressure. New political alliances emerged. A fascinating one is a coalescence of the anti-vax movement with the extreme right. They see each other as an ability to strengthen their movements and gain more muscle. The fact is that democracies in general are simply going to be harder to govern in the future. We have new sources of conflict. There's no direct line from virus to terrorist bombings, but it is clear that pandemics, through isolation and other factors, accelerate radicalization. They do deepen social and political divides. They leave behind very deep resentments, and they demonstrate models of protest and popular resistance. In terms of looking ahead at the world, we're looking ahead at a very turbulent world. We are, as I say, we're in the midst of a war in Ukraine. Throughout history, epidemics and wars have circled each other. We can't say that there's direct causality because there's so much warfare and there are so many outbreaks of disease that they are close to one another at any given time. But there is a link between high disease stress in some societies and the prevalence of internal armed conflict. Outbreaks of disease weaken state capacity, they foment political discord, and indeed in the United States many people fear that we are heading toward a civil war. Does it increase the likelihood of bioterrorism? I don't need to go into this in any detail because Brian Dodwell has covered it so well. I don't think it offers terrorists new capabilities or open new paths they haven't thought about, but it certainly has inspired a lot of extremists to think about how they might weaponize COVID-19 or other biological weapons, and that's not a good result. Let me conclude there. Jonathan, I've given you back 2.5 minutes of the 7 I took before, but on my terms.